Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the actual repair process on the incredibly sad Polanthropy Alpha M. If you guys are just tuning in now, I encourage you to watch the previous 2 videos that I did on this topic. But in case you don't want to, just know that right now I am servicing one of the Alpha M cameras made by Polanthropy. Well, invented by Polanthropy, I should say. These particular ones were not made by Dan, but this one was sent in by a client because it didn't work, and, well, the reason for it not working is becoming increasingly evident as I fix this basket case of a thing. In the last episode, I effectively redid all the optical assembly. I cleaned the viewfinder mirror, the Fresnel, the taking mirror, the curved mirror. We replaced the motor with a slightly slower 16,000 RPM unit. I put a smoothing capacitor down. We resoldered much of the original ribbon cable. What else did we do? And just generally checked out the shutter. I redid a bit of the soldering on the PCB. We are going to focus on the shutter today. I will go through what I'll be doing in just a second. And in the last episode as well, I took out the original LED ready light. The main thing that I want to be doing on this camera is twofold. I have to fix the autofocus today because it is incredibly slow and sluggish, likely because the idler gears are really gummed up and in need of lubricant. I need to resolder the ribbon cable back to the PCB, but most importantly, I also have to remove fungus from the lens as well. So quite a lot to do today. The body is effectively finished, although I do need to wire in my PolaVolt solution. I will do that in another video. Today I really just want to focus on the shutter, and there is just so many parts of this thing that we need to do. The first thing I want to do is just remove the focusing wheel. I'm also going to remove the light dark wheel and the walking arm to give me the best access to things. So first thing I'm going to do is just score a little mark on the focusing wheel so that I know exactly how to put it back and in what position. I haven't actually tested the focusing like towards infinity, but I don't think this is even focusing accurately because, as I've said in previous videos, the infinity symbol on an SX-70 sonar, when the lens is at rest, when the lens is at its furthest point back, it shouldn't be sitting at infinity. It should actually sit just behind infinity. And that's because if you engage the autofocus, when the autofocus focuses on infinity, it should move the lens forwards exactly 1 tooth, right? So if you're focusing towards infinity and you hit the autofocus, it will engage like that. Well, this is already set to infinity, and that's a very common mistake that technicians make when they reassemble cameras like this, is they set it to infinity being in the middle when it actually should sit just behind infinity. So when I actually do reassemble this thing properly, and I go to test, I will likely have to calibrate that and put the lens in a better position, basically. But I digress. There is so much wrong with this thing that I could be here for... Well, I already have been here for hours. Yeah, this is one of the most disappointing cameras that I've seen in a very long period of time. Like, considering how much my client paid for this, this thing is complete junk. It will be amazing by the time I'm finished with it. Alright, these screws don't want to come off without a fight. You can blame Polaroid for this one. I've spoken about it on the channel before, but Polaroid loved to cost reduce things. Basically, as the cameras went on throughout the years, Polaroid decided, you know, they settled on more and more ways to reduce the cost. One of the things that they did, maybe because it saved a bit of time during the factory production, is they migrated away from using screws to hold the light dark wheel on into something called scrivets, which is like, I don't know, kind of a cross between like a screw and a rivet. They're sort of like a single-use fastener version of a screw. And instead of having a thread, the thread's at like sort of 45 degrees, so it's kind of like a nail. Maybe scrivet is the wrong word. I think they're called scrivets. Anyway, It makes getting these damn things off very annoying sometimes. And I don't like them. They're horribly annoying. Sometimes they get embedded in the plastic so well that when you try and remove them, they actually snap. That's very frustrating when that happens. So I am having to apply... Someone's letting their dog walk up my driveway willy-nilly, and I'm chasing them. Let's see if you can hear that in the background. But yeah, sometimes you have to physically pull up on the light dark wheel to get the darn thing off. All right, now I will remove the little red thing here. All right, and now that gives us access to the idler gears a little bit better. Another thing I'm going to do is just remove the screw above the electric eye here. And I'll show you as to why I'm going to do that. Let's lift that up. Just going to poke my head outside for a second. Nope, everything's good. I just wanted to make sure, because my dog is just sitting outside my workshop at the moment, enjoying the sun, and I want to make sure she's not being bothered by other irresponsible dog owners. All right, Okay, so what doing that does, I just took out the screw just above where the electric eye is. What that does is allow me to slide a screwdriver in there and disengage the idler gear from the main lens, and that will now let me completely remove the lens here, as well as let me pick off. Now this idler gear actually feels pretty good. Like this is actually nice and loose. It is this one that feels like, see that spins nice and freely, so that's not a problem. It is the spring-loaded idler gear that I'm gonna have to do something about. And I am actually, I'm kind of praying that I will be able to actually correct this, because otherwise I'm going to need to swap the entire shutter housing. Sometimes Polaroid, because of their cost reduction, these spring-loaded parts, actually it might not be cost reduction, but when they change the design, sometimes you'll find that these idler gears are just set under too much tension, and it makes turning them very difficult. When you take the washer off, of course, it spins more freely, but when you put that washer back on, it puts everything under tension. So I might try, just see, because I've got a few idler gears sitting here. I might see if I can find one that is perhaps a little bit looser. So I think this one might work a little bit better. I'm just cleaning the insides out. I have lots of spares of these because I take them from broken cameras. And yeah, I think that one is actually going to work a little better. So let's put the plastic washer back on. Sometimes you can get the original like brass washers that hold the, like later models like Alphas and Sonars use these little plastic washers which are hard to see to hold the idler gears on. Earlier cameras use little copper circlips. I find that the copper circlips tends to put less pressure on the idler gear, so that may be a solution, but that spins so much freer. Cool. All right. I'm going to take a little bit of Liberty oil and just literally put a drop on there just so that the idler gear doesn't bind up as much. As I said, I was actually concerned about the idler gear in between the autofocus housing and the lens, but this spins so freely. Again, I'll put just a little drop of oil just on the main shaft and really just work it in, and then take off some of the excess so that oil's just seeping underneath the washer. You do not need a lot of oil for this, literally like half a drop. Now that should hopefully result in everything spinning a little more freely. Good. Another good area to lubricate is the motor itself. So there is, you can see the shaft for the motor pokes out on the top. Putting a little bit of oil down on that, down on the bearing there does help it to spin. You only need a little bit and then you can just wipe off the excess. All right, now I'm just gonna get my lamp and inspect the lens, because I'm looking for that fungus. Yeah, so the fungus is in the rear cell. Now, speaking of Polaroid and cost reduction, one of the things that they did when they released the Alpha and Sonar cameras, they went away from using a metal lens body to a plastic one. With the metal lens bodies, you can get inside and clean the rear element by physically separating the two metal halves. They're epoxied together. On the plastic ones, you cannot do that because everything is plastic welded together and that lens is effectively sealed. However, it's got two slots that the aperture blades must travel through, so dust and debris and fungal spores do get in there. They can grow, they do form fungus, and unfortunately, the only way to clean that properly is to cut the rear lens cell out. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. I'm actually just gonna put a fresher blade in my scalpel here. Let's see, that will do. And I'm gonna cut the lens out. So there's a plastic lip that holds the glass on, and we have to remove about half of it. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now you can do this with the PCB in place, it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to take this one out. It's already sitting in there nicely. And to be honest, the little terminals for the contacts on the front here have been kind of mangled. So I don't really want to be removing that part, because then I'll need to replace it, and at the moment, the bill is already racking up with this thing quite significantly. And, you know, for what was effectively supposed to be a free job for my client, for basically the cost of shipping and me making this video, that we're going to get a PolaVolt, this has turned into a full overhaul. So I am actually charging the client, they are paying me money for this. I have some blue tack here. What I've done is chopped half of that plastic lip off the rear lens. Now I'm using blue tack, and I'm gonna basically stick it to the glass and rapidly pull up a few times, and then the glass cell will come out. All right, now it's left about half the plastic lip on one side. So what that means is when we go to reinstall this piece of glass, we'll be able to push it in, push it down, and then the last thing that we'll have to do is secure it down again. Now, there's a few ways that you could do this. You can use like glues, like epoxies and optical balsam to do it. I actually find the best way to do it is plastic weld. And when I say plastic weld, I have here the focusing wheel taken from a broken old Model 1. This is made of the same plastic as the shutter housing, and the same plastic that the lens housing is made out of. And you guys can see here, it looks like it's been chewed on. And that is because I take my soldering iron, I will melt a chunk of it off, and then I will press it in and form a new lip over the glass. That is the best way I've found to do this. Like I said, there's multiple ways that you could do it. There's other glues and epoxies. I mean, even pressure fitting it in might be okay, although it's likely going to fall out if the camera takes a big jostle. I find plastic welding to be the best because it's instantaneous. It's a very stinky job, so make sure you do it in a well-ventilated room, but it sets instantly. As soon as that plastic has cooled, it sets. And that means it's rather easy to trim and press into place, and you can cut it away again if you need to. As I said, you could take the PCB off for this. I'm not going to, because I'm concerned about then having to replace all of this bit here. I'm honest to God gonna leave it. Also, the solenoid legs look like they're on their last legs because they've been bent backwards and forwards too much. So I'm not gonna risk having to replace any more parts than I need to on this stupid camera. That's why I'm not taking the PCB off. You also don't need to melt the entire lip on. Just simply holding it together on both sides is fine. You don't need to go the full 360 degrees. It's already held in place on the right-hand side. We only need to make a little lip on the left-hand side. So, now that everything is open, we can clean the inside of the lens. So I'm gonna get some glass cleaner on a cloth, and while I do this, I'm just gonna speed up the footage. All right, the glass is now back in. I'm just going to clean the rear surface where my thumbprints were from just clicking it back in. I now just check it again one more time to make sure I haven't missed any massive bits of dust. And now I'm going to plastic weld and form a lip. Just going to move some parts out of the way and get my soldering iron here. All right, can you guys see that big blob I've just put on there? Now, as you do this, you will note that some haze does appear on the lens. Don't worry, this is just the byproduct of the plastic melting. The glass is very hard and will not be affected by this. That will clean off in a second just with a bit of glass cleaner, but you can see that what I've done is I've melted a very large chunk of plastic onto the edge, onto the plastic edge, and then over the glass. The reason that this works is, as I said, the plastic from a focusing wheel and the lens cell are exactly the same. So as the two melt, they melt into one another, and it forms a bond. And that bond sticks together as well as the original lip on the camera. So effectively, we've made a new lip. Now, what I'm going to do is melt away a good chunk of that remaining plastic, and then I'm actually just going to use a screwdriver and scrape away. Again, Polaroid's glass is incredibly strong. You do not have to worry about damaging, scratching, destroying the coating, anything like that. I have done this technique for years now, and I have never once damaged a lens cell. It is just that strong. Might seem like a bit of a brutal technique, but trust me, this is the best one that there is, and it results in the neatest looking job when you look at the lens from the front. All right, that is looking a hell of a lot better than it did before. All the fungus is now gone. All we've got to do is just clean a little bit more off the rear of the cell where some of my fingerprints are, and this lens will be looking as good as new. Now, it's worth noting that I would not normally do this if there was just a few specks of dust in the back of the lens, because dust will eventually wind its way up into the lens. It's all just part of the SX-70's design. Unfortunately, when you have an open design where the blades are going to travel through the middle, dust will eventually get in there. It's not really a big deal. But fungus is. Fungus, even though this fungus likely stopped growing sometime around the 1980s, fungus still looks horrible, and it affects the resale value of cameras because everyone is quite concerned about it. So I will remove it in cases of fungus or in cases of haze. The lens cell, the only way to clean it, is to cut the lens cell out like I just did. Yeah, I wouldn't normally do that if it was just a few specks of dust. But in this case, I am certainly going to, because that lens was in a very sorry state and it should have been rectified by the previous technician. All right, so the front cell is actually very clean though, which is good. So I'm guessing that the technician cleaned the front cell, but did nothing about the inside. I'm just using my lamp here to check the quality of things. Sorry if I go off screen for a second here. Sometimes it's easier for me to just lean to the side and see exactly what I'm doing. I try and keep everything on screen as good as I possibly can, but when you're dealing with very fine work, and very fine parts, sometimes it's very difficult. And if you're watching my videos for repair tips, I mean, obviously you're going to have one of these cameras in front of your face, so you're going to be able to see with your own two eyes exactly what I'm seeing. There's actually a little bit of fungus on the inside too. All right, so maybe the technician didn't clean any of the optical surface. There's a tiny little bit. I thought it was a little piece of fluff at first, but it didn't budge. And that is because it's fungus. What a disgrace of a camera. Dear, oh dear. All right. Looking good. Okay. Now we can put everything back together. Now I need to separate the sonar again. Now I'm going to set the lens to just behind infinity. Can you guys see how I've set that? Right? That is where I'm going to set this thing, because I reckon that's where true infinity for the sonar is going to be. Next thing that I'm going to do, this technique I showed off a little while ago. I had to show Linus how to do this because greasing the cam follower can prevent very, very niche issues from occurring. Generally, the cam follower does not need to be greased. In fact, the official repair manual tells you not to do this. But I have found that over time, some of them can start to stiffen up, and it can cause the autofocus to kind of stick in certain positions. So I've just started a habit of greasing them regardless of the camera model. Usually you only need to do it to like Model 1s, which tend to have particularly sticky cam followers. Lube really helps those. Generally you don't need to do it with sonar cameras, but it can go wrong. And since I've got this thing open anyway, and since I've got my grease and I've got my various parts, well, I might as well just do it preemptively. Because that is the name of the game with this particular camera. I'm going full paranoid mode, above and beyond. Because I really want to be the last person that has to touch this particular camera. My client's already been taken for quite the ride. There we go. Just synchronizing the lens. Okay. Now, when we put this thing back together, it should focus a lot more freely than otherwise what it was doing. All right. I'll just put the little light dark wheel on. Oops. Which I will just also clean the rear of because it's pretty dusty. Cool. And put that on here. And I'll hold it in place with one of those stupid scrivets. Cool. All right. I'm going to pause it there, come back, and we will resolder at the rear of the PCB. All right. Now, one thing that I've actually just noticed, and I wonder if I can even get my camera to focus on it, there are two tiny little pads here with a scratched trace, and there is nothing here. I wonder if a component has been knocked off of this PCB, and perhaps that's why it doesn't work. Either that, or a component is meant to be taken off, depending on what what shutter you install this into. And the reason that I say that is on the SX-70 PCBs, there's actually a resistor that you have to remove if you're going to put it on an SLR 680. But that resistor stays in place on an SX-70 sonar. And there are terminals here underneath the ribbons to mount this PCB to an alpha camera. So it's got both connections for a sonar ribbon, but it's also got connections for a standard flash fire assembly on, say, an SX-70 Alpha. So I wonder if maybe this component is missing because it's only supposed to be there if you hook it up to like an Alpha. I have messaged Dan. Luckily, the traces appear to be intact, so if for whatever reason that component is missing, I will be able to replace it. I just need to know exactly what it's supposed to be, which is annoying because I don't have schematics. Anyway, regardless, I'm now going to solder the ribbon cables back onto this thing, and I'm going to do as neat a job as I possibly can. All right, one ribbon cable down. Not exactly the easiest job in the world since the ribbons had been so butchered by the previous technician, but I think I've done a pretty darn neat job of that. And we have a ribbon cable now nicely attached. All right, what should I do now? Probably I will put this thing to the side for the time being, and then we can focus on PolaVolt modifying the body of the camera, and then put the entire thing back together and see how well it functions. Actually, I've decided I'm not going to end the video just there. I might as well reassemble this thing and give it a bit of bench testing. Now, I know I've already taken out the battery terminals, but I have wired up together this little, well, I guess it's a portable version of my PolaVolt, but just with wires. We can easily use this to test the thing. I want to see if I've managed to fix that autofocus issue. So what I want to do is just hopefully put the ribbon cable back in place, put the shutter back in place, and get the thing just assembled. The only thing I've done is add some insulation tape to where I had been soldering, just to make sure that it doesn't bridge on any of the metal lens board. And yeah, let's try and put this ribbon cable back, hey? Seems like it's gonna be a relatively tricky job. Yeah, I don't love putting back ribbon cables. All right, that's in. Okay, now just use my screwdriver to... All right. We'll put that on like so. I'm just gonna hold it in place with like one screw or two screws for the time being, just until I can make sure that everything works. We'll put that here. Okay. So that should be all screwed in. I've obviously got to reattach this ribbon cable to the side, so I'm going to solder that in just a second. Remembering that I have disabled this with Kapton tape. So the first two pins there, I have disabled. And that is to eliminate the automatic dark slide eject mode. All right. I just want to tack that ribbon down. And really all I want to do now is just see, does this thing still power on? This little battery box that I'm wiring up here is going to simulate what my PolaVolt battery mod will eventually be doing. Cool. We have power. Wonderful. As you guys can see, the autofocus now works as it should, and much snappier than it did originally, now that all the idler gears and stuff have been cleaned. So, the last thing to do now is calibrate the shutter and PolaVolt mod it. Alright guys, one of the last things that I have to do before I wire in the PolaVolt is calibrate the shutter, or at least attempt to. As you guys would have seen from the first video that I did on this camera, the photos that this thing's produced were wildly overexposed. 1/2000th of a second turned out pretty much completely white, which is just unacceptable. Now, my hunch is that this camera's solenoid is completely out of spec. And if that hunch is correct, then it should be relatively easy to correct. In order to do that, I'm going to use the calibration method that I developed for the SX-70R project. And this is all based under the assumption that when an SX-70 shutter is in working order, at various different speeds, it will make different shapes in the aperture assembly. So I've got a little piece of card here, and then I've got some blades from inside an SX-70 shutter, And if you guys want more in-depth detail as to how the blades work, especially during flash, check out the video I did on the Mint flash bar and check out the video on the SX-70R PCB. But effectively, when these blades are at their widest point, that circular hole here is f8. And because speed of the shutter blades and aperture are linked because of that teardrop shape, the blades as they travel will make various different shapes at various different speeds. So when the blades are closed, as you see here, if we take a very slow exposure, those blades will open all the way up to f8 and then close again. If we do a very fast exposure, they'll open a little bit and then close again. Now we can use the shapes that those blades make to calibrate the shutter. And that is because through lots and lots and lots of trial and error, I have found the following. A very small rectangular shape in the aperture is 1/8000th of a second. 1/4000th of a second is a small diamond shape. And 1/2000th of a second looks like that. Now, the way these blades are shaped is specific to the Sonar and Alpha cameras. An SX-70 Model 1 and the SLR680 have slightly different shaped blades, so what I'm showing you won't necessarily apply to everything. If we, for example, get some earlier blades here, and I'm going to try and demonstrate again, the shapes will look very slightly different. So, for example, on a Model 1, 1/8000th looks a little like that, 1/4000 looks a little like that, and then 1/2000 is something like that. Okay? Now I've gotten so much practice at this over time that I can do this by eye. And honest to God, the technique that I use is as accurate as using a high-speed camera once you've got a bit of practice at it. And hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate this calibration method successfully and then prove that it is accurate by going outside and taking some test photos. But yeah, effectively, it's really easy to dial in 1/2000th of a second using a set of alpha blades because of that little teardrop shape, right? The teardrop shape, effectively, what you want is when those curved parts of the diamond, when the diamond is at its biggest, tip to tip, that's about 1/1500th of a second. So slightly slower than 1/2000. What we want to do is, if we're aiming for 1/2000, we want that to be just slightly more closed. So it's a large diamond shape like that. So what I'm about to do, I've hooked up batteries to the little test pack that I have here. And I have this device. This is a set of LED lights that I've put a switch in, inside a pack of film. Actually, I didn't put them in there. Well, I wired that switch in, but this was actually sent to me by a client of mine named Zach. Zach effectively tried to mimic a device that Polaroid built back in the day. See, Polaroid had a test rig, which was effectively like, I think it was like a neon tube. It was some kind of light built inside a pack of film, which you would insert into the camera with the purpose of testing for light leaks in the bellows. Now, personally, I think these light-producing packs are a terrible way of testing for light leaks in the bellows. The best way to test for light leaks is literally to take the bellows off the camera and inspect every inch of them. And so when he sent it to me, basically saying, hey, I replicated what the factory tool used to be, I was a bit like, well, thanks for that, but I don't really have a use for it because I inspect bellows more thoroughly than that. But I did realize very quickly that this is a great way of seeing how exactly the aperture blades are working. So if I fire the shutter, hopefully you'll be able to see. Let's see. Yeah, it's on automatic mode. Hopefully you'll be able to see in the camera. Yeah, can you see the shutter opening? Now, you might not be able to see that because of the way my camera is synchronizing, right? This thing's firing at 30 frames per second, and obviously the shutter might be firing faster than that. So maybe if I try block the electric eye a little bit. Right? But you get the idea. I can now see light shining through the lens. And what that means is I'm going to be able to now dial this in to 1/2000th of a second, and I am going to be able to look for that aperture blade which I just showed you. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Now, unfortunately, this is not going to make very riveting viewing. I'm just going to sit here in silence, and I might just speed up the process. Alright guys, it's Jake from the future talking here. It's been over a week since I recorded that footage that you saw just then. And unfortunately, I have reached an impassable obstacle in terms of this camera. It just absolutely cannot be calibrated at all. The shutter speeds are wildly intermittent, even on manual settings. So what do I mean by intermittent? Well, if I get a set of aperture blades here, effectively, my hunch was correct. The solenoid in this was set far too loose, right? The screw had been adjusted too loosely. The blades were traveling much too fast. But even tightening the blades to a factory specification didn't help in regards to the camera firing at correct speeds. See, it is possible for a solenoid on an SX-70 to go out of sync, right? Basically through oxidization, wear and tear, and aging, and lots of different reasons, these things can lose their ability to work within tolerances, right? Now, when that happens, you'll have a hard time dialing in faster shutter speeds. I encounter this problem every now and again when I install SX-70 PCBs for clients because they go all the way up to 1/8000th of a second. Sometimes you will get solenoids where you can easily dial in 1/2000, but 1/8000 will never open, or you might be able to dial in 1/8000, but then 1/2000 opens far too wide. Regardless though, if a solenoid is out of spec, it should at least be consistent. So, you know, for example, what I just said, you might find that you have absolutely no trouble dialing in a 1/8000th speed like so, but then when you go to retest again at 1/2000, you know, it might be opening like way too wide, right? Or you might be able to dial in, you know, a good little diamond shape at 1/2000, right? But then when you try to test at 1/8000, the blades don't open at all. It'll be consistent, right? Even if the solenoid's out of spec, you should get results that are fairly reproducible each time you test the shutter. It might drift a little bit, but it should be pretty consistent. Well, what's happening with this camera is when I set it to 1/8000 or 1/4000, sometimes it opens a little bit, sometimes it opens quite a lot, but most of the time with speeds above 1/4000th of a second, the shutter doesn't open at all. And that's why it was giving me, for those that remember the first video, that's why it was giving me these blank black photos. Now, when I slow the speed down to 1/2000th of a second, I get wildly varying results. 1/2000th of a second sometimes fires as if it was 1/8000, sometimes fires as if it's closer to like 1/500th, other times is kind of correct, but it varies by a good 6 stops, seemingly at random, just by hitting the shutter. Now, that leads me to believe that the board itself, the PCB inside this camera controlling all the Alpha M electronics, has a fault. Now, as for why it has a fault, I have no idea. It's very possible that the technician broke the board somehow when installing it. And that would make sense given the poor quality of refurb of the camera in general. It could be that maybe the firmware didn't flash to the camera properly and it's causing some kind of an issue. My issue here is now, for me to test this any further, I'm going to need a new PCB. I would effectively need Dan from Polanthropy to send me a replacement board to install in the camera to see if I could fix this. Now, in terms of what my client is dealing with, they have reached out to the entity that sold it to them. This was over a week ago, and they are yet to hear anything back. Now, what I'm pushing for here, and I've reached out to the entity that sold my client this camera as well, I'm encouraging a partial refund for this thing. I don't want my client to get this camera completely for free because, well, they would end up with an SX-70 for free. But I certainly do not feel that the price paid for the refurb and the extra electronic components have been worth it. Because my client has ended up with a camera that was poorly refurbished, non-functional, and all of those things should have been picked up simply just by film testing the camera. Nothing about this camera screams quality to me. The quality of the refurb, from soldering to fungus in the lens to the slow autofocus motor to fingerprints on the mirrors, you name it, watch all the different parts in my video. Absolutely none of that suggests professional work. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it suggests amateur quality at best, and certainly not something worth several hundred US. As I said, I don't believe my client should get this camera for free, but I do think that what they should be refunded is the difference between a market rate second-hand SX-70 and what they paid. And then they can use the rest of that money to have someone like me refurbish it properly and back up to spec. Now, my understanding is that the entity that my client purchased this camera from isn't actually performing repairs at the moment, for reasons that I won't go into, right? So that would mean even if, hypothetically, my client was able to send this back under some kind of a warranty job, there would be currently no one able to do it. Meaning that maybe the entity could outsource the work, but if you're outsourcing the work, you might as well outsource it to me, right? Like, someone else that's an independent is going to have to redo this camera, and I'm just as capable as anyone else in this field. So again, that circles me back to, for me to get this thing working, I'm going to need a new board. Now, I reached out to Dan to ask his thoughts. Unfortunately, Dan has been unable to or unwilling to provide me any solutions in regards to troubleshooting this any further. His suggestion so far has just been to send it back to the original entity that sold it to them, which then circles back to the problem that I was just describing, meaning that, well, if we do that, there's no one there that can actually fix this thing currently, so they're going to have to outsource it anyway. And so if you're going to have to outsource it, well, you might as well outsource it to me, but I can't do anything more because they're going to need a new board. And trust me, anyone else that ends up with this camera attempting to repair it is going to end up in the same boat. So unless I'm able to convince Dan to sell me, I'm not asking for it for free. I've asked Dan if I could purchase a new board to install into the camera, but so far Dan hasn't responded to that request. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the reason is for that. It may just simply be that he is still on holiday. As I said before in the last video, he was on vacation when I spoke last, so that may explain why he hasn't responded to many of my messages. It could just be that he doesn't want to insert himself into what could be seen as some kind of third-party repair drama between companies, even though, as I said, I'm not requesting any of this for free. I don't want any freebies from Dan, but I would like to provide my client with a working camera. As I said, as far as I can tell, there's nothing inherently wrong with Dan's design. It seems fine, but I think the purpose that I'm trying to get across in this video is that if you don't have a technician installing these upgrades that is competent, the camera just simply isn't going to work. You can't expect to just slap a new PCB in one of these things and have the camera magically function. It just doesn't work like that. And that's really what I've been highlighting this entire time, and that's what I highlight regularly when I do these kind of teardown videos, is when I have cameras that have been poorly refurbished, what my goal is not to trash others, right? I generally never name and shame. My goal here is merely to educate and show people what needs to be done to get the best caliber of work. And so, effectively, if I can't come to any kind of a conclusion with any of the parties involved here, ultimately the only thing left is going to be to just simply convert the camera to become an SX-70R, which is totally doable. If I desolder this Alpha M PCB and install one of these, then the camera will work like normal. It would just be a very expensive donor camera. I could remove the sticker, I can remove the leather, and I can remove the little additional button pressing system, and I should be able to easily convert this to become a standard looking SX-70 with a manual control PCB that you could then use a dongle with. Or the phone app for SX-70R. And so that is unfortunately where I'm going to have to leave it at this particular time in the video. I really did want to do a review on the Alpha M and compare it against my Open SX-70 and my SX-70R cameras, but it just simply looks like that won't be possible at this time. Yeah, so sorry to end on such a bum note, but unfortunately, that's just where we're at. And unless I get more cooperation from the entity that sold the camera or from Dan from Polanthropy, then unfortunately, we're going to be stuck with this brick of a camera. Now, before I finish, I want to just address some potential questions which some of you might be having, which may be, well, Jake, what if it was you that broke the camera by tinkering around? And you know what? I think that's certainly a valid criticism. That's a fair point to raise. But I have some rebuttals to that because I certainly don't believe I had anything to do with this. First rebuttal is that my client themselves had bad quality images with this particular camera. Now, unfortunately, and I think, you know, far be it from me to victim blame anyone because, I mean, look, my client expected a fully working camera because they paid several hundreds of dollars for it. But my client did test it with a single pack of film. They attributed that overexposure to X-ray damage. And from what I can tell, they took a few photos. Some of the photos that were indoors using slower shutter speeds turned out fine. And well, as I've already explained, that's because slower shutter speeds under like 1/25th of a second tend not to be problematic. It's really only when you go outdoors in a bright sunny scene that the camera needs to be fully calibrated to get the best results. So, like I said, my client had overexposure issues. Admittedly, they incorrectly attributed that to X-ray damage. Second rebuttal is that before I took the thing apart, I noticed straight away just by using my eyes and ears that the shutter on this thing didn't sound good. And then my film test, yes, I spent a good $30 Australian worth of film on this piece of junk. My film tests generally resulted in completely washed out photos, or at speeds above 1/4000, it alternated between not opening at all to just, again, being wildly overexposed. Automatic mode was no different. This is the kind of results that I got. So yeah, not only did it not function for my client, it didn't function well for me, and I've also attempted to do things like replace the solenoid. So those that are very observant will know that this is not the original solenoid that was in the camera. This is actually a known working solenoid that I pulled out of one of my SX-70R converted cameras. So off camera, I've swapped a lot of parts to rule out every single possibility that it's a hardware fault. And from what I can gather at the moment, there's something wrong with the PCB that's in this camera, And like I said, I'm not going to blame Dan. I can just as much put blame on the technician that assembled this, because clearly they've screwed something up here. But yeah, I've swapped the solenoids and it's the same story. Wildly inconsistent results, and sometimes the shutter does not fire. So I've tried 3 different solenoids and got the same thing on every single one of them. It is not a hardware problem. I have fixed all the hardware problems in the camera. I also have tried multiple different power sources, from 6 volts connected into a wall wart, through to PolaVolt, through to literally just wiring in an original 600 pack of film with fresh batteries. Everything is exactly the same. There is no way to get consistency in this thing's shutter. It just will not happen. So, as I said, none of this performance issue has anything to do with the work that I've done to the camera. It was performing poorly this entire time. And if anything, I've improved aspects of the camera, such as the autofocus motor. I've tried different motors, I've tried smoothing capacitors, I've tried every single possible power supply alteration under the sun, and nothing works. So, that's it for this video. I can't continue any further. So yeah, it might be another week or 2 before I do another part to this video, because ultimately we need to decide what it is that we're going to do with this thing. And yeah, you might see this thing end up being turned into an SX-70R camera. Hopefully, I mean, I would love a replacement board in order to get this thing working again, but as I said, that's not in my control. Anyway, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the day. As always, if you like what it is that I do, please feel free to donate using links down below, or when it's my next repair season, hopefully mid to late August, feel free to send me something to overhaul and repair for you. This is my full-time job, and if you like the content that I produce, find a way to support the channel, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff, and I will see you in the next video.